get started. Welcome, everybody. First, I just want to say hello. I'm Susan Williams. I'm a new affiliate of the workshop as of this year, so I don't know most of you, but I'm looking forward to getting to know you. And today, Jessica Steinberg is going to be presenting her paper. Jessica, for those of you who don't already know her, is an assistant professor of international studies at SGIS and an adjunct professor of political science. She is, in addition to being affiliated with this workshop, also affiliated with the Center for the Study of Global Change and the Center on American and Global Security. She received a PhD in poli-sci from the University of Michigan and a BA in political science from Stanford. And her research interests include the political economy of development, governance, natural resources, and violent conflict. And she's going to just speak for about 5 minutes to situate the project, and then I will take names. And since I don't know names, if you could actually tell me your name when I put you in the queue, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that welcome and introduction. Also, thanks to you guys for taking the time to read through what is, as you may have noted, a rather early draft of a new idea that I'm looking at. So this is sort of a new research agenda that I'm pursuing, and I thought this would be kind of a great point to get feedback, particularly from the workshop on it. I had sort of thought and worked through some of the sort of theoretical foundations and questions a while back, and had hoped to have data, which was supposed to come in at the end of August, and it came in Sunday of last week. So that is, so I decided last minute to, in fact, try to include it, or at least some of it, into this so that I could provide you guys with a bit of background on the context in which I'd like to sort of evaluate some of these hypotheses. From what I am able to tell, there are not a ton of potential opportunities to test these hypotheses at this particular moment in time. It looks like Casamance, potentially Ispat in Indonesia, potentially Nepal. And Casamance, the folks there were really interested actually in having someone look at these kinds of questions. So it was kind of a perfect synergy between sort of what I was interested in and what some of the groups in southern Casamance were sort of interested in doing in terms of understanding what the effects were of the kinds of common forestry institutions that they were supporting. So that is the context of this. What I really love, I'm sure that there will be questions in a variety of different dimensions, but I would love suggestions about, hypotheses that maybe I haven't considered, or cases I haven't considered, or points of clarification, sort of all things that generally tend to come from this group. But in particular, I'm really sort of open to changing this around. This is not getting submitted to a journal anytime soon. So I'm really interested in drawing on your expertise and breadth in sort of thinking about alternative hypotheses as well as alternative cases or even comparative cases. So I am not, I don't think, going to say much more about it unless there are sort of clarifying questions, but I think I will just start, looking forward to your thoughts, questions, and suggestions.
Sure. So this is really, fascinating, and we all have a good understanding about commons and cooperation and trust and all those nice things that make commons work, or the absence makes them not work. And then I have difficulties, so maybe you could help explain a little bit more when you talk about these conflict environments as to how, if we're talking about trust, and if conflict's an absence of trust, or maybe it's not. If you're getting recruited by some rebels and, oh, sure, why not? It's like somebody knocking on my door. Oh, sure, why not? I'll convert. So, to explain a little bit before we, when you go out there in the field, who you're going to be asking questions to, what is this conflict environment, because the way the hypothesis is framed now, which is, it's fine. There may not be any theory that can help us. It may be that it's purely an empirical question. Because you say, depending, it could go this way or this way. So I guess unbundle, at least for me, a little bit more, if you could, what you see, and you mentioned it up front, these different, so there's a conflict, and there's a let's say peace, conflict, post-conflict, and you're going to look at all of those, presumably, or people's memories of those. Is that the strategy? Or just unbundle conflict, sure. and how what heuristic, in general, the heuristic I think about is not cheating on the commons, trusting, so forth. What heuristic would be spilling over to these conflict situations? Normally we think about spillovers to other public goods provisions. So that's what I'm not clear about.
So that's helpful. So let me try to unpack how I'm perceiving or thinking about these sort of contexts. So more and more, particularly with sort of Stathis Kalidas' book on sort of civil conflict, there's been this sort of way of thinking about micro-level dimensions of conflict, so that the differentiation between necessarily peace, conflict, post-conflict is a little bit less muddled, particularly at the micro level. So that you can have boundaries, you can have stated start and end agreements of hostilities, but for people on the ground, that may have little bearing in terms of exactly what it means to go about livelihoods. And particularly, I'm thinking of in Senegal, what this means is, whether it's relatively easy or safe to go to your plot, which may be on the other side of the forest, right? Are you likely to encounter members of a rebel group who's still in operation, even if they're not carrying on large-scale sort of attacks, but which there is sort of persistent, ongoing insecurity and threat either to livelihood or violent threat as a result of the continuous persistence of these sort of rebel groups who are armed and continue to operate in this area. So so if we sort of zoom into a specific spatial context, I kind of want to consider these regions as regions in which there are armed actors that continue to operate in some form or another, and the intensity of their activity may vary over time. I'm not differentiating between those two as being peace versus conflict. I think of those as sort of a partial equilibrium of insecurity, usually sort of low-level conflict, or at the end, after official hostilities have stopped. But if you ask anyone on the ground, the idea that there is sort of that we now have peace is sort of not a relevant statement. So then the question is right? Are there? So then each individual, as they come into contact with this context of the presence of armed actors who may be operating in and around where they live, they may have choices about how they behave with respect to those actors. One might be to sort of, particularly if they're compelled to come into contact with them, one might be to allow them to do whatever it is that they are doing, whether it's in some cases cutting timber to supply or to provide revenue for the group. In other cases, actually providing permits. In other cases, it's actually defining territory in a rebel camp, right? And that those sort of interactions present individuals with choices that they wouldn't otherwise have absent of that conflict context in which they're sort of armed actor. Right? Does that start to...
No, that's helpful. And I was thinking you might want to look at literature in South America where they look at forests and, again, these community or common pool forests and drugs. So Christopher Anderson's got a couple of papers that have looked at this. You can go to his webpage at Colorado. So it turns out that he found that conflict was very disruptive to these common pool resources for all kinds of reasons. The guys with guns won and got what they wanted.
Okay.
So, but that may not spill over here. So.
Okay, great, thanks.
So I think Federica was next, and then Jimmy.
So I want to follow up on Li's comment and then ask a different question. One, the comment is, it seems to me, and this might be largely, it might largely apply, but it seems to me that the depiction here is like the communities are good guys and the rebels are bad guys. Mm-hmm. And what it seems to me that there might be, and as I'm formulating this question, just to kind of like locate this in the literature, I'm thinking of Weinstein's Inside Rebellions, kind of like a description of how rebel groups operate within their environments. And I wonder, what about the relationship between the communities and the rebel groups might help you identify a specific or a more specific context in which the bad guy, good guy dynamic actually applies. But this in turn kind of like connects to the next question. The next question is, all right, let's assume, and probably this doesn't apply so much in the context of forests, but let's assume that you have a successful CPR, a successful group that manages the resource, right? Managing well the resource raises the rents for the rebel groups to actually appropriate. And so in the dynamic between, again, like the question here is between really the dynamics between the rebel groups and the communities, and to what extent raising the rents by providing a profitable resource is actually not so much. It probably becomes not so much the likelihood that community members will take up fighting, but the fact that community members will be expropriated by the rebels because they are providing rents.
So I just take a quick point to respond to that. That's a really helpful way of painting something that I've been grappling with, in part because, particularly in the context of Southern Casamance, communities know who the rebels are. They're members of the communities. Right. There isn't so much a good guy, bad guy, although because there are two rebel groups, there's the perceptions of each of them are quite different. And so some have particular kinds of perceptions about them as opposed to others. But in general, the idea is not that there's good guys and bad guys. It's that and that's actually one of the things that I want to get at, is that what are the incentives that, right, given that this arm factor is already in place, right, what are the incentives that allow people to sort of get past this good guy, bad guy thing and say, when is it either in my interest economically, or is it more relevant that I have developed this set of norms and beliefs about how one should behave, regardless of how it affects me personally, versus sort of these sort of institutional complexity spillover mechanisms that are sort of the second half of the thought. But I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about it. Your other point about sort of increasing the rents for rebels, that's not actually in there anywhere, and that's a really, really great point. I have to think about it. It may actually, in the instance in which that happens, it may provide a useful test actually after the fact, right? So if I can identify situations in which that's actually happened, which actually Sajo's group, the rebel commander who actually protects the forest, would be useful.
Right.
So yeah, I'll have to look at that. Great.
Great, thank you.
So I think Jimmy was next.
Yeah, I really like the paper, Jessica. I was thinking, let me just first comment on terminology, because so as you get into this, at least in my mind, what a CPR is not clear to begin with. So first off, there's just this notion of a common pool resource versus a common property resource.
Yeah.
You need to make it clear which direction you're heading. And so in essence, it depends on whether they're actually property rights, they just happen to go to a group. So that's one thing. But see, I think you're using also the term CPR as the group itself, the organization itself. And I think you're going to, at least that's when I was reading it, that was kind of what it seemed like. And I think you just need to come up with another term that you're going to call that institution. And I don't know that there is a common term for that institution. It's a facilitating, organizing, coordinating institution, right?
An organization.
But it is an organization
that has rules
to facilitate the use of this common property.
Okay.
So it just will help.
Okay.
This is just words,
No,
but
helpful.
it will help sort of put it into that category. So my main point is, I think what you're doing is actually you have an idea that fits in a broader literature, which is just about, it's about organizations within society that have these positive externalities. They could have negative externalities. So mafias, you might think of as having negative externalities, but it fits back into that literature that partly relates back to Putnam and his story about social capital. I know you bring up social capital, but this idea of social organizations and the externalities that come out of those. But even if you think back to the original ideas behind religious organizations and things like that, part of the argument there was to sort of create an environment in which you raise these kids not to go off on these bad paths in some sense. So I think, to me, your story is more interesting if you sort of frame it within those, and then you're looking at a particular type of organization and situation within that broader literature. At least that's how I was interpreting it. And my final point, I think, if you can, as you start to do the field work, would be how do those organizations vary? Going back to at least in terms of their rules. So some look? They really could be about rules that limit. They could be about rules that could be about information. They could be about a lot of different things. And if you could start to tease out what are the types of organizations that have stronger positive externalities, then you're really going to take this to another level in a sense. I think that's it.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, and then I have the gentleman back there and two more. The thing I wanted to do was to sort of complicate what appears to me to be an assumption underlying your models that isn't explicitly expressed. And the assumption seems to be that the conflict groups are antisocial and anti-CPR, anti-commons. And what I want to suggest from my own experience in Burma is that the four hypotheses that you offer would play out very differently against a different set of background assumptions. So in Burma, at least in some of the ethnic minority states, the armed groups are the representatives of the communities. The state is the threat to the common pool resources. The state is exploiting those resources and it's excluding people from them. And the armed groups are defending the common pool resources against the state. And they are really, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture, they engage in abuses as well. But in certain parts of Burma, the people really believe that the armed organization is them. In Kachin State, for example, people don't say the Kachin Independence Army, they say our Kachin Independence Army. In that setting, it strikes me that maybe all of your hypotheses are going to operate a little differently. So, for example, you're suggesting that if the sort of common pool resource works well and generates income, it will make people less likely to join the armed groups. Well, no, actually not in this sort of a setting, right? If the common pool resource works well, it's in part because people experience the armed group as providing the protection necessary to allow that. So it might increase their likelihood of joining the armed groups. In terms of the norms, right? Common pool resources instilling sort of pro-social norms would not lead to resistance to the armed groups. It would actually lead to joining them because the armed groups are understood as sort of carrying out those communal norms. And the strategic one, I think, is really interesting. The question then, I suppose, would be if the armed groups actually operate more like sort of the community itself, might the strategic behaviors be more similar? That is, it'd be hard to measure spillover if, in fact, the same behaviors are optimum in both settings, right? So I think it just might be worthwhile to think about this different set of cases to broaden the impact of your hypotheses.
Yeah, that would be helpful, especially the story that you mentioned about Burma makes me think actually about Pakistan, India, and the way in which that initial armed group began, which was very similar to what you just described in Burma. Some of those dimensions I'm hoping to capture with the extent to which, it sounds like the story in Burma, the complexity of the situation is actually relatively low from what you...
Well, I've oversimplified, of course.
Never mind,
All right.
but point taken. I will definitely look into sort of thinking about the extent to which, how much these hypotheses really rely on the inherent assumptions in them. I should say particularly the first one is really sort of one that I put out there because it is sort of the way that the literature and the development community works.
Right.
The one that they rely on the most.
Right.
Not because I necessarily.
Right. No, I agree. And what I think is interesting is that there is in fact a particular, there's a particular way of talking about conflict and post-conflict situations, right? That international organizations and development organizations sort of are stuck in. And it assumes that they're all the same in terms of the armed groups being the disruptors of social order. But that's just not true. There's a range of situations here, and depending on where you are on that range, all of these things, I think, operate differently.
And I should add in particular, because in the case of Casamance, the government, or the state actually is one of those that is recognized to be over-extracting, particularly in forested regions that are not either clearly defined or those that are clearly defined and classified as state territory. Right? That's a great point.
Okay, so
Just quick.
Sure.
So this is one of those. What do they call those?
Right
on the same point. This is actually where you could build in a more formal model getting into this that specifies exactly the type of preferences and types of objective functions one group is facing and the other group is facing, and then you sort of protect yourself from the vast world of all these other possibilities. Right? You're saying you're looking at a certain class of types of organizations, right?
Jessica, thanks for sharing this. This is really interesting stuff. I'm wondering, I was particularly interested in the unpaired institutions and complexity section, and it made me think about some of the work that has been done on ethnicity or ethnic, and the way that ethnicity forms networks and embeds people in sort of these alternative sets of institutions. Javier Armada et al.'s co-ethnicity book, Willie Tsai's Accountability Without Democracy. And so, are you in H3 and H4, I mean, they're kind of making they're hypotheses for different sets of behaviors, but like H3 in particular, is what you're saying that participation in these CPR management regimes helps people know and understand their community better and creates these links that makes people's behavior observable, and so decreases the likelihood that they're going to engage in these wartime economy extractive behaviors? I mean, or is that a different hypothesis than that I'm making?
So hypothesis 3 is really actually based a lot on some of the Bednar and Page work that looks at how individuals, or automata actually, if they tested it, react when their sort of cognitive load is increased to a point where they can't find the optimal strategy. So what happens is they participate in a simpler game, right? And because they're then faced with a more complex game, Jenna measures it with this measure of sort of entropy, but I'm sort of trying to think about other ways of measuring it. That when the other institutional context in which they're participating in is more complex, more actors, more interdependencies, more difficult to evaluate what the optimal strategy would be, that there's spillovers from that first context. That they say, okay, well, this strategy worked really well here, and I don't have enough information to know what's going to work really well here, so I'm just going to use this strategy because that's what I know. And then maybe later I'll adapt, but at this point, the idea is that this context is so much more complex and difficult for the player to wrap their head around that then
war economy, for example.
Yeah, exactly. However, hypothesis 4, and this is a good point, kind of goes in the opposite direction, which says that by nature of participating in the CPR, which I definitely take Jimmy's point to heart on that also means that you learn, right? You sort of, by necessity, you have to have local knowledge, and there's monitoring involved, particularly in the particularly successful ones, right? And that as a consequence, you may actually then be able to figure out how to play both games really well, because by way of gaining information in one, you may be able to gain more information in, for instance. So the way this would look actually on the ground, right, is that by way of being someone who monitors the use of timber in a given forest, right, and goes every day into the forest to check to see who is cutting and who is not, and, right, you may also get a sense as to which members, who is in there that is not, supposed to be in there, when they're likely to get caught, and when you're likely to get caught if you actually take a bribe from them. So in some ways, there's going to be a little bit of difficulty in differentiating observable outcomes between these two hypotheses, but the idea being that the first, there's spillover in sort of a heuristic, not really certain how to deal with this increased cognitive load problem, right? And the second, it is, the first actually allows me to gather enough information about the second that I can play both games really well.
Yeah, so I guess the hypothesis that I'm trying to articulate here is that because I participate in a CPR management regime, I learn how to stop conflict, essentially. Like assuming that I view the conflict as detrimental to myself personally, unrelated to sort of my economic returns that I get from successful management in the forest. But participation in this institution, builds this. I guess it's a social capital argument. Builds this social capital that then, helps me be a conflict stopper. It helps me be a peace
Okay, so
builder.
inherent in that hypothesis is the idea that there's some loyalty that accrues to a particular group. Is that true or no?
I think what this hypothesis assumes is that people have an interest in the end of the conflict.
Okay.
Or that an individual has an interest in the end of the conflict.
That is essentially might be, so is that a collective interest or an individual interest?
I mean, I'm thinking about an individual interest.
Okay. So one way to think about this is it the case then that the individual interaction with a rebel, a rebel actor in the forest, right? They can either look the other way, or they can take a bribe, or they can call them out on it, right? And what it seems to me that you're suggesting is that is there a context in which when they call them out on it, their personal gain to doing so is higher?
Yeah. Okay. So it's a collective interest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I want to get that seems to be a bit more part of the pro-social discussion, where there's sort of a larger potential thing in the future that's going to happen that you sort of play towards because you've been part of this institution that.
Okay, and you believe it works. Okay, I guess that is the pro-social. I was just wondering where this ethnicity and networks.
Well, I think there might be a room for sort of networks both as information providing mechanisms, but also as potentially sort of loyalty generating dimensions as well. So I need to think through that a little bit more.
I was thinking more about the information that's inherent in the information that gets generated from participation in the CPR management regime.
I like that term.
Okay.
Colloquium.
I really enjoyed reading your paper. This is about local governments, and this is what I do, so excellent. But my question is about how context-specific these hypotheses are. Because I read the pen and I couldn't avoid thinking about how applicable they are to explain the post-conflict scenario in Colombia, if that is going to happen, yes? And please correct me if I am wrong, because the way that I read here is that the conflict is related to the particular resource that was generated, the CPR. So my question is, how these CPRs work in context in which the actual conflict is not related to the resource that generated the CPR.
Yeah.
In that way, it could be more generalizable and it could be applicable to these other cases.
So thank you very much. That's actually the direction that I had hoped to go, but I wasn't very clear about it, in part because some of the case-based literature on this, particularly coming out of USAID in the policy side, that sort of seeks to look at commons and common property strategies for managing livelihoods in conflict and post-conflict regimes, tend to be about that particular resource. And what's interesting about Casamance is the original conflict wasn't really actually about timber. It was really about sort of a separatist attempt by the Casamance, led by Salif Sadio, and then MFDC, to essentially get independence from the rest of Senegal. And it just so happened that timber ended up being both useful for a subset of the rebels, and also useful for Gambia, who is fantastically meddling in this area. And as a result of the conflict, kind of became relevant. But at the outset, it wasn't a conflict about timber. I don't know that I did a particularly good job of demonstrating that. But then the question is, okay, where's the threshold there, right? If it shifts to timber being relevant here, which again it's still in this context not the central issue of the conflict, although that is the dimension of the conflict that makes the media most commonly. But at what point is it sort of central enough that now that's really what we're talking about? And I'm not quite sure how to answer that question just yet, just because of the sort of, if we think about conflicts as being super dynamic and the extent to which rebels and non-rebel actors rely on various forms of resources, natural and otherwise, right, to sort of fund their campaigns, particularly when certain forms are cut off and others become available. Is it sufficient to say if that wasn't the initial grievance, right, does it still constitute a broader context in which it doesn't actually have to be a central issue? So to me, this context is in fact similar in that timber wasn't initial. The forest wasn't an initial point of grievance. It did become relevant as the conflict went on, particularly as cutting down the forest started to really affect people's livelihoods. But I'll have to make that a lot clearer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really love the paper, just as a preface. I had two questions. My first question is, I was wondering what would happen if you did find that your null hypothesis was false, but I think there's this kind of assumption that it's the CPR management itself that's causing all these spillover effects, and part of me wonders if it's not just there being NGO and development organizational activity, because they have those official looking like jeeps and things, and I just feel like if I were a rebel I wouldn't want it. I don't know much about the conflict literature, so that's just kind of something
You raise a really good point, right? Even we know that rebels often take advantage of influxes of aid and a variety of other resources and areas. But that doesn't get around what is a very good point, which is what else is going on here that I might need to take into consideration that really would matter a whole lot for the outcomes that I'm hoping to observe, right? And that's difficult, right? Because and this gets to the sort of there's an additional problem there, which is these are largely, in some ways, at least externally facilitated, if not externally supplied organizations, right? Which is not normally the context. So we've got two problems here. We've got the sort of influx of aid, and we've got the fact that those very actors are sort of helping to facilitate these organizations. So the extent to which aid or the presence of sort of an aid and local and aid industrial complex, which really actually is present, particularly in Ziguinchor, in sort of southern Senegal. So all of those organizations are largely based in the cities. They do a fair amount of work into the field, and one of the things that's impressive about the context of southern Senegal is the extent to which these NGOs really are partnering locally in a way that I haven't seen elsewhere. For better or for worse. For better in that, we would love NGOs to be doing that more. For worse in that, research-wise, that might not be super great for me. But So the spatial difference might help a little bit, but I don't. It will be difficult, right? In part because we know that as conflicts wind down, those first 5 years are when tons of aid goes in, and trying to figure out whether that aid is actually doing anything related to changing these outcomes, separate from this particular intervention, is going to be difficult. So one thing would just be to try to control for the other kinds of interventions that these communities are experiencing. ASAPED in particular, this organization, while there's lots of overlap in terms of how these organizations operate, this one in particular has one of the largest networks, particularly in this area, that not a lot of other organizations are working on. It's a start, but point very, very well taken.
My second question was just something I was curious about. So I know that you mentioned the literature that connects poverty to conflict, and you kind of, it seemed to me that you were arguing that that was the implicit assumption on the aid agencies' parts on why they were trying to link common pool resource use to like other types of security effects and things like that. But I was really curious if you have any idea of whether you were ever able to talk to the development organizations themselves to hear.
Yeah. Okay. No, they expressly said that to me.
Okay. Yeah, that was really interesting to me because that's not something I would have immediately thought.
So I think Dean is next.
Yeah, thanks. So I think you really need a tighter link from the hypotheses and how they're derived to the data. I found that link not so tight. So I'm trying to imagine a common property resource. I mean, a framework where there's a common property resource, a forest, let's say. One of the reasons for having a common property resource, common property organization, among others, would be to have joint enforcement. So the conflict might be from guys trying to steal the timber or graze in the forest or what have you. That's a different kind of conflict than I think you're kind of imagining. That is, in fact, it's not so clear what it is. I don't know the setting basically at all. So there could be different kinds of violence coming from common property resource. Could just be there's timber thieves who are trying to steal our timber. That's not the same as rebels trying to take over a larger geographic area. So that's a different kind of model. And the hypotheses are about the CPRs. Frankly, some of them have so many embedded clauses. I don't think they're testable really. If you look at H4, you can read it yourself. But I don't know how you test that. And so then, but the hypotheses are about CPRs typically. So then it seems like you need data at the CPR level, but that's not really what you're collecting, I don't think. As I understand it, that you're sort of surveying villagers, not CPR members. So that's where tightening that link from some model of a CPR that would generate violence, maybe different kinds of violence, to the kind of data you can get would be important, I think. And some of these hypotheses may be derived from a model you have in mind. Some may be derived from literature too. It's not so clear. But again, some of them are really hard to imagine as something you could test. At least for me, anyway. That's sort of my basic point.
I mean, I do have some. I actually have interviewed the. They have a 1 next to them, and as a member of if they're a member of a forest committee, the respondents have a 1 next to them, and so we know who actually participates in part of the governing structure of the forest community.
But as a forest community, I don't know anything about these here. Are they anything like what we think of as a well-defined CPR that's exclusive and has internal rules of using the forest, or not, or sometimes are they?
Yeah, so there are different stages in that development. So the earliest ones have been doing this for 10 years or so, and they have gotten approval from the state to define and delineate the boundaries that have been then legally delineated as community forests that are then sort of managed by any village that is on the border of that. And each one of them may sort of have a shared committee that allows them to manage their portion of that forest. and they develop themselves the rules for the management. And so I didn't include those survey questions, but I have lots of questions on the nature of the rules, how exclusive they are, how well monitored and enforced they are, and whether people are satisfied with the sort of resolution of them. But
and the nature of the conflict, too? Do you know what it is?
Yes, right. So this one, the conflict was going on long before the CPRs really existed. So they, particularly the build out of these CPRs is really in the context of the ending of, or the post conflict scenario, which this is a separatist conflict, but lots of the environment has been destroyed, and essentially these organizations are going to try to facilitate the development of these forest committees for the management of community forests in the area. But I think it's a relevant point. I sort of threw the data there really quick without a lot.
Well, if the data would allow you to distinguish between types of violence too, that would be really nice.
Yeah.
I don't know if you could, but maybe, and that would just give more power to your approach.
Yeah, I have a little bit of that, but we should talk more about it.
So we've got Tom, and then Lauren, and then Lee.
So this is kind of the direction I was thinking. I do think it would be, Lee actually was telling me that I shouldn't be looking things up on Wikipedia to educate myself about Senegal. But I was doing that, trying to get a sense of the history, the history of this conflict, and it does seem like the way you set it up in the paper, it almost seems like you're anticipating the reader is going to suspect that it's an ethnically driven conflict, and then you immediately start talking about natural resources. And so I really got the wrong. I'm now hearing the clarity of what you're saying verbally, but in the paper,
okay, thank you.
So that would help, I think, wrapping that around. But I see there's kind of two pathways to conflict, and there's two literatures that I'm aware of, and I'm not an expert on conflict, but there's like the conflict with a capital C, and like all the conflict databases, and those are very much driven by these empirical measurements of how many deaths have occurred. And then there's this other totally separate vein of conflict literature, which is much more driven about like the natural resources stories. Mm-hmm. And that really is motivated largely on scarcity, and that scarcity is the trigger that then results in conflict. It might not be violent conflict, but it might be conflict. And so my thought is what you might consider doing is two things, not to like hammer the geography nail here, but there are databases that you can get that are publicly available that would let you monitor what the land cover resources are. And so you could, I don't know what the footprints are, and I think Dean's points about, is there an exclusion zone where you could like say this is the boundary of this CPR, and that's often very hard to do. You don't have these very clear polygonal boundaries. In the absence of that, though, you could at least take the GPS point of the household and just look in a 5-kilometer area around that person, and then just measure whether there's been an increase or decrease of forest resources over time. The problem with that is that often these illegal timber harvesting practices are not really a land cover change, that is, forest to nothing. It's like the forest degradation. And that's much harder to capture empirically, but I do think that, on Dean's point, you do need to get the forest side of this. So I don't know if you have questions in your survey where you're asking people whether they perceive there to be a degradation of the forest resources. And I think in the absence of including that, there's just a huge kind of disconnect between the interweaving of the capital conflict C story that you're telling and setting up and the little conflict C story, which seems like more where your research is going. So
so actually I started looking at the ACLID stuff to make sure that, for instance, there wasn't a serious endogeneity problem where these institutions were being set up based on where there were significant, right, that I wasn't going to end up with, we know that cooperation increases after instances of violence. Lavin, Miguel, a bunch of other people have suggested that. And so am I really just going to get that factor? So that's why I initially started looking at ACLID in this context. And was hoping to look at some more of this GIS stuff to really overlay things like ACLID on the forestry changes. But even locally, they don't have these maps locally. And now there's been a lot of sort of Guardian articles using drone pictures to get a sense of recent massive changes.
Well,
but I haven't seen.
Like so you might just write down Hansen. Hansen is one data set. It's a Google published. You can get it globally. It shows you deforestation rates over the last 15 years.
Okay.
But I don't think that those deforestation data sets are going to help you as much as the individual's perceptions of degradation. But the main point is that if there's abundant forest resources and people are illegally going in and pulling stuff out, that doesn't really trigger conflict generally.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think.
I'm hoping that it doesn't.
So did you have some questions in your survey about whether people perceive there to be a degradation of forest resources, and what did that show?
Yeah. So I do have questions about whether they perceive degradation and which species actually, and for what uses and by whom. So and on average, there is variance, although it heavily skews towards degraded. But those communities that have CPRs that have been in place longer are the only ones that have suggested that it's not degraded.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, again, this is like 80 or 90 people, so this is still really small. But there is, I wouldn't say there's data that supports that, there's sort of, that CPRs are yielding better forestry outcomes than non-CPRs, but I would say that it at least does not undermine it. And then it sort of also has questions as to which kinds of species, and then whether who they're being cut by, and for what use. But I would love to actually hear more about other ideas for questions that would be relevant to ask, because it's not really my area. So I would love to talk to you more about that.
Lauren.
So I think this is a really exciting project. We've talked about it a little bit already. One of the questions I had sort of builds on the earlier discussion from Susan and a little bit Federica, and thinking about whether the way that you're sort of conceptualizing this is missing the complexity of these communities and people's individual kind of embeddedness in multiple overlapping communities. And so I'm wondering even if there's first an endogeneity problem in terms of the international NGOs where they pick to start these things, right? So there's something about these communities that's special to begin with. And then if an individual is participating in a community, a lot of what you're talking about in terms of potential mechanisms, sort of what they get out of that participation, is about information, it's about learning, it's about strategies. And I'm wondering if we get something about belonging and about identity, and that stuff, they may belong in different ways to this group, but that I would want to know more about this group and how that might overlap in certain ways with rebel groups in the area. So that it's not such a simple sort of, these are not dyadic interactions in the forest, that they're much more complex. And then, so a couple people have talked about ethnicity as a potential identity that's important, but I'm also wondering about gender, and we talked about this a little bit, but how gender might overlap or be in tension with, or you haven't talked about these actors in terms of their gender, so I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so all of those are really helpful, and I'm trying to parse through. I really clearly have to think a little bit more about ethnicity in this context. It's a little bit difficult because in the area, for instance, the longest standing CPR, and by most accounts from all the ones that I've talked to, most effective, is the most diverse. It is run by a Fula. The group is largely Jola with a few Mandinka and a few Manjago, which is incredibly impressive. And it's right on the border of Gambia, which means it's the most threatened. And so then we sort of get into, okay, cleavage salience and sort of group salience, and which is the relevant sort of source of loyalty. And it's tough because most of these communities beforehand actually were displaced and then came back. And so I would imagine, though I haven't asked them expressly, I would imagine there's already a very strong sense of returning and sort of being in this space together and occupying this community together. I also imagine that is affected and changed very much by the recognition that a subset of those people continue to be members of rebel groups. And I'm struggling with how to get at that because I can't quite ask them that. I can't, I mean, it's still not at a point where you can ask someone if they are part of a rebel group or not. But to your other points, it's sort of, in general, it seems like one of the things that I really need to push on and think clearly about is what is sort of the mosaic of groups that people belong to and which ones are activated and how are they cross-cutting and overlapping, both in terms of gender, ethnicity, and other kinds of organizations. I do have a question as to whether people participate in more than one committee and how they feel about other villagers. But it's just a start.
Kirk has a follow-up to this.
Yeah, sort of on this point about how you ask questions. Is it possible to ask people like how many of their neighbors or what percentage of their neighbors they think are part of rebel groups, and that helps give you an impression of people's sense of support for rebels within the community?
So I think they're unlikely to answer that because one of the side effects of the way in which this conflict happens is that if I had a problem with you, I would tell Lee that you were siding with the rebels and he would go kill you. And then your brother would then come back to my village and kill me. And so the idea that I would suggest that I knew anyone of any side is one of the particular flashpoints of of this conflict. So
it's also, if you had a community where there was a lot of sympathy and support for the rebels, then they would have no incentive to defect then.
Yeah.
So if you had a lot of social capital, then it's possible that you wouldn't get good answers to that question. So it was a bad idea. I've wasted everyone's time.
No. It's helpful, right?
Can I also throw in just a quick follow-up? One of the things I was struck by is that the CPRs that you're talking about are, how can I put this, artificial.
Yes.
They're created, right? But of course, CPRs are often traditional, organic, right? And I'm wondering about the difference between those. That is, it strikes me that that organic CPRs that pre-exist a conflict might have certain kinds of effects on that conflict, whereas artificially created ones that are structured by some outsider, and then they come in and they say, you're going to have these officers, and they're going to have, that sort of structure would have maybe a very different effect.
Yeah, that's a great point. What is helpful about this context is that the way that it happens is that NGOs go to a variety of different, particularly ASAFI, the one that I've been working with, goes to a bunch of different communities and says, we can give you some money if you want to do this. Mm-hmm. And I actually have a question that says, did you form a committee in order to get support from an NGO? But once they say yes, everything else is up to the community. They decide, they elect the members, generally speaking, although there's some variance depending on how developed the organization is. They decide what the rules are, who can participate, how many women or men are on the committee. So that is largely self-determined in the way that we think of it being, but the impetus for it is sort of initial.
So that's really interesting, and I think it connects to the ethnicity issues, obviously, and the other sorts of identity issues, right? The organic ones usually have some kind of identity component, and these artificial ones may have much less, and that might have changed the operation. Lee.
Yeah, this is all in the same point. So I think with your data, you could have this selectivity problem in that you don't survey anyone who's not in these CPRs.
I do.
You do? Okay, because that's not clear.
Sorry,
Because the way you said it is just like now, these guys go out there and inform everybody, but then if these NGOs are like most NGOs or governments or anybody, they're going to pick winners. They want these things to succeed. They don't want them to fail because then they look bad and you can't get more money. And, that's how they stay in business as NGOs. Or the government does the same thing. When I was in Ecuador for cooperatives, which ones get funded? Secretary of Agriculture said, well, we give them the ones that are going to succeed. Yeah. Because, hey, resources are scarce. So I think you've got that problem here with that. You've got these folks that they self-select into the data that you're surveying, and then though you said something that I think needs to be. Well, could this really be true? So then they step back and they say, okay, But now we're going to do a needs assessment, and we're going to select those villages that have been most affected by the conflict, so as to target their community building efforts in these areas. I don't know. I mean, that's a little bit, maybe, but that's really important. If it's needs, or is it most likely to succeed? Yeah. And then in terms of this is Lee's sort of one of his 5 things to everybody. Don't think so much about the data as testing a hypothesis. I think it's way too early for that. Think of it as a diagnostic, and think of these as some correlations that will, sort of along Dean's point, that will then later allow you to develop more rigorous testable hypotheses and refine the kind of data you need to actually test that hypothesis. So I think we think of econometrics or data generally as providing tests, when in fact, frequently they just enrich thick narratives. So I would argue both are very important parts of telling a compelling story, but we tend frequently to give weight to that part that's quantitative sometimes. But to do that, I think you need to make sure about the selectivity issues and biases that you might have coming from your data.
Yeah. So I'm struggling here with this problem of the fact that I don't know that there are that many other places to look at it.
It's not that it's bad. I mean, you can use biases in your favor.
My thought this summer was really, I want to get a lay of this land and figure out
that's right.
What
that's
are the
diagnostic
questions. And I think one of the things I'm really trying to struggle with is, again, this was sort of like, what are the universe of possible hypotheses here, which ideally there'd be more than 4, but that's what I came up with to start with. And then to sort of maybe narrow them down after the fact. The selectivity problem is something I'm really struggling with, because there's an ethics and research here issue that I'm really having difficulty with, which is that these communities, particularly ASAPID, really wants to know how effective and when their projects are effective and how people are interpreting it. And so, and in some ways has the social capital to be able to ask the kinds of questions that are interesting both for them and for me as the researcher. We can't even get into some of the rebel group territories without sort of them leading us or escorting us, or me as the case would be. So I'm not quite sure how to get around the selectivity problem, other than to do this over time question,
that's always
one thought I was trying to do.
Great is to do a panel, but also just your second clause there. I mean, it could be, but as long as you have some kind of measure of needs in there, so that if they're targeting those that have bigger needs, how you said that, but how do we know that? And to that extent, then that you can code people.
Yeah.
They were from one of these truly needy places. This one was they were just really successful, and they wanted to fund them because they knew they'd be successful. So we can generate, the outcomes based on the needs versus the endogeneity problem that Lauren was addressing, and Susan.
Great. I think we're at 1 o'clock. That was really wonderful.
Thank you guys. That was really, really helpful.